Today, we're going to be discussing the rise of the Spanish national team and their success winning back-to-back European Championships in 2008 and 2012 and their historic World Cup win in 2010, the only team to ever achieve this feat. So where did it all begin?
Well, it actually began with Johan Cruyff in the late 80s. He was appointed Barcelona manager in 1988. And previously, Barca were well respected in the Spanish game, but they'd only won one league in 14 years. And by the time he left, after his 8-year spell as manager, they won 11 major trophies, including 4 consecutive leagues within that period and the European Cup. He always emphasised attractive football for the fans. He thought football, you can be successful and you can play football that people want to watch, because previously the successful teams in Spain had played a very almost workman-like style of football where they'd have 1 or 2 brilliant players, almost similar to kind of 80s, 90s English sides, where you'd have your Gascoigne who goes and does something amazing, and you fit the workman around that. So classic Spanish teams who were successful were very workman-like, very hard, very tough, didn't play particularly elegant football, especially not the football you'd associate with Spain now. So when Cruyff took over the management of Barcelona, he really instilled flowing football. He wanted attractive, attacking football. And that captured the imaginations of coaches and young players throughout that generation. And it kind of brought through a following generation in the 90s and early 2000s of players who were much more technically capable, who were much more elegant, who weren't so workmanlike. And that kind of builds on to that second generation of players who went on to win all of these international tournaments.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about that is, as you say, those early years, especially through the 80s, they were really struggling, and Spanish football had not a lot to show for. But as they're approaching that sort of end of the 90s, you started to see the Real Madrid and Barcelona come alive. And what's interesting about those early teams is that you look at the Real Madrid team that won the 2002 Champions League final. They had Spanish players in that team, but they were predominantly sort of defensive players. You had Salgado and Hierro, and then you had the other side of the pitch where you had Raúl and Morientes, but the bulk of the midfield players was Makelele, Figo and Zidane. So this emergence of these midfield players was quite a shock, because these early years you actually didn't see much of these Spanish players coming through. They were known for, as Joe said, being quite physical actually and quite workmanlike. And you look at the Barcelona sides that first emerged. You look at that again, that early 05-06 year where they beat Arsenal. They only had 3 Spanish players in the side, and that was Puyol, Valdez, and Oliver. And okay, you had Xavi and Iniesta on the bench, but it's only a few years later when you again look at the 08-09 team and the 2011 team that they had 6-7 Spanish players. And now you had a majority Spanish side that predominantly had come from the La Masia academy. So you had players that had been playing together since they were 14, 15, some of them. So what was so impressive was that you'd gone from this side that really hadn't been that impressive in keeping the ball and playing this attractive football, that you now had this Tiki-Taka football that had come in, and all of a sudden they were dominating, where previously those Spanish players weren't really known for their midfielding football.
So what changed then? What were the systemic changes in Spanish coaching? What was the cause in the production of those young players that broke through after the 80s and 90s?
This is actually a really interesting topic, and it's pretty revolutionary. It's something that's really been adopted by the successful national teams, even the ones that are winning now, the French national team, the German national team. So in the early 90s and late 80s, the Spanish team were referred to as La Furia Roja, the Red Fury, because they were known as being a physical, pressing, kind of dominant side in terms of fighting for the ball. But in 1995, the Spanish FA kind of overhauled the way they approached coaching, and as a result, the way they produced players. And in 1995, they started to transition into just La Roja, the red one, rather than the Red Fury. There wasn't as much of an emphasis on going and dominating physically. So in 95, they wanted to prioritize really high level, accessible and comprehensive coaching education through a national program. Before that, coaches would kind of come up through the ranks on their own. There wasn't really a particular huge structure to the way coaches progressed. But then they introduced, very similar to the way the FA are doing in England now with your level 1, level 2, UEFA B, UEFA A, there was a pathway introduced for coaches. And along that pathway, they were taught the Spanish way, and they were taught how to teach kids the Spanish way as well. So rather than kind of encouraging clubs to bring in high-level, big names from across the pond, they really encouraged the use of Spanish players. But from the late 90s to the early 2000s, they used this coaching philosophy to really prove the fact that they could produce players that were worth bringing through rather than going and buying someone else. So every summer, and they still do this to this day, the head of the Spanish youth coaching and his staff and 19 regional scouts from all over Spain agree on a list of the 55 best 14 and 15-year-olds in the country. They pick 5 in each position. Over the season, these players will live and train at the national centre in 3-day camps once a month. So every month they spend 3 days not only getting the best coaching the national team can provide, but also living and training together as a squad. So as they grow up through the years, they're used to being around each other. They're used to the group dynamics. They make friends within those sides. And this builds the Spanish way from a really young age. In the January of that season, the 55 get cut to 33. So then they're left with only the 3 best players in each position. But that continues all the way on through to the end of the season, where they select squads for competitive tournaments. And that process is the same for every age group up to the under-18s. And they even try and do it with the first team, where they don't go, we know this player has been brilliant in the past. They actually try and really objectively pick the 55 best Spanish players from across the country. And then at the time, Del Bosque, as the manager, him and his staff would cull that list down to their initial entry squad into tournaments. So they took quite an overarching approach and tried to really consider the youth players that were coming through, the new players that could break into the squad, not just the ones who'd been there 5-10 years and just deserved the place based on their historic production. So they really overhauled their system in the mid-90s, and you started to see that really come through in the late 2000s when they started to dominate sides, but not just a successful squad. They were a squad that had grown up and learned to play the game together. So they had that team bond, that team dynamic from when they were children. Then even though they went to go and play for Barcelona versus Real Madrid competitively, they were used to that group dynamic of them all coming together. And that bred that team success that came in the late 2000s and early 2010s.
I think that's really important when you think about the fact that you had these two powerhouses going against each other. And I mean, you know about the El Clasico derbies, they hated each other. You had the pig's head being thrown on the pitch. Do you know what I mean? That's the level of rivalry we've got here. Yeah, you look at some of these other teams, you talk about that English golden generation that they often look back and say, well, what did they win? They didn't achieve what they should have. And look at what the likes of Rio and Lampard said, where they'd go on these tours and breaks apart from each other, and they'd sit on their own tables, and there was this sort of competitiveness. And yet with these Spanish sides, even though they did hate each other, when it came to that national team environment, they all came together. And okay, it was a predominantly Barcelona side, but you actually look at, there's plenty of Real Madrid players in that side, and yet it still seemed to work quite well. That, as you say, that dynamic, perhaps coming from an early young age, meant that these players didn't quite feel this rivalry when they were in these camps. They could separate the league from the national side.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think you can really compare to how England are nowadays, and you look at that camaraderie amongst the young English players, and you have to ask yourself if the FA and the coaching systems that are in place in England sort of took a look at those 80s, 90s, early 2000s Spanish way of doing things and sort of tried to implement that, because you do notice a lot more of a cohesion in the current crop of England players. You look at the likes of Mason Mount and Declan Rice. They've spent time together in youth academies, playing together along with a lot of the other players in the setup. And it's interesting to see how you do, as a fan, get behind that more as well. You love to see your England team performing. And I think that was a big reason as to why the Spain team at the time was so cohesive and gelled so well and were so popular, because you really saw that team spirit.
Yeah, that's That is very accurate, especially from courses I've been on as a coach from the FA. They've been very open about the fact that they've taken cues from Spain, from France, because France have Clairefontaine, which is their national centre as well, and they do a very similar thing. And obviously, they won the most recent World Cup. So there is massive historical proof that children and players that grow up as teammates, as having that team camaraderie, go on to be more successful at national level as well.
Let's talk about the men leading the helm of this current crop of players, these Spanish superstars, Aragones and Del Bosque. What did they sort of bring to the setup?
Well, Aragones was the manager in the 08 tournament, and he actually in 2006 they go out against France in the first knockout round, and that's when he decided that actually they needed an overhaul in the national squad. And he actually made the really brave decision to cut a number of high caliber players from the squad, including Raul. That sent shockwaves through kind of the Spanish world, because they'd always played with fast wingers, with one lethal striker, with Raul, and he was still in his prime at that point. So it was a very brave decision to cut him. Yeah. But actually, they cut those big names, and going into the 08 squad, he went with smaller, more technical players who could dominate the centre of the pitch rather than the wide areas. And that's when you had the central midfield of Xavi and Senna, who were very technically dominant in the middle. Senna was more defensive than Xavi, but Iniesta played nominally as a left midfielder, but actually would often drift centrally. The same with David Silva on the right. They actually created a lot of dominance of space and possession within the centre of the field, which is almost completely opposite to the way they played in the past. And this is when you start to really see Tiki-Taka come through, because they really emphasise dominating the central areas of the field, being patient in possession, being able to change the speed of the ball whenever they wanted, because they were always within reach of the ball. There was never a need to just, kick it and hope. They always dominated possession. And as a result, because they're all close to the ball, when they lost it, they could press and win it back really quickly. So they almost defended without having to defend a lot. And this obviously was proven really effective. But at the time, it was a massive step and something that took real guts from Aragones and was then carried on by Del Bosque when he took over in 2010.
I think what's really interesting about this shift in focus towards possession is that you have a lot of these early understandings of football, an early analysis that showed that the longer you hold possession, the less likely you are actually to score. There was this sort of wide-held belief that the more direct you are, the long balls that you see, the route one approach in football was always the best way to score goals, because every pass you make is an opportunity to lose the ball and lose your attempt to score. So what was phenomenal about this was it completely redefined the way I think everyone saw football, which was keep the ball and find that pocket of space, which Barcelona just executed perfectly. I mean, you look at the defence in those early years, people used to laugh at the way they'd pass it around the back. There was times where they'd pass it 20, 30 times at the back because they were waiting for those pockets of space. People thought, well, what's this? This is a waste of time. They're not doing anything. And what people were missing was that they were tiring out the opposition, moving the pitch one way, moving the other way. And in that time, they'd wait and find that pocket. And that meant they would open up so much space. And even though they played very, very compact, they'd all push up in a way that meant there was always a player free, even wide.
Yeah, and this really comes back to the way they were all brought up together, which is the coaching of the players was actually very prescriptive. They were drilled, even as youngsters, on their principles in and out of possession. They were drilled on formations, on how to defend. They were even drilled on distances between lines in terms of midfield and defensive lines. They were told you have to have not only the player on the ball, you then have to have two players close to them immediately to form triangles. And the reason they wanted triangles is not because of the pretty passing, but because it produces numerical superiority wherever the ball is. They would always have more players than the opposition in that area, so they could keep it. And then when they lost it, they could swarm and win it back just as quick. So that really, really started to take over. But actually, it's interesting. If you look at the possession stats, especially in the group games, in 2008, they averaged 50% possession in their 3 group games. So they didn't immediately dominate in terms of possession stats, but the the effectiveness of that possession was really evident. And then their possession stats definitely jumped up 59% in the same 3 games in 2010 and 63% in the same 3 games in 2012. So that Tiki-Taka style became even more ingrained, even more of a habit and more difficult to play against as time went on. But in 2008, they weren't dominating games possession-wise, especially early in the tournament.
So we've explored the birth of this philosophy and how it was cultivated over time. But what about club-level management, player breakthroughs, and the tactics that were implemented, such as a false nine or a midfield overload?
Yeah, I think was something that completely sort of revolutionised football as we know it. It's not the first time a false nine's been used before, but what was phenomenal with this was that you still had great strikers in that Spanish team. Okay, you were getting players like Raul coming to the end of his career, and you even had David Villa and Torres perhaps not performing quite as well as they had been, but they were still top players with big reputations. So for you to then go and still pick the likes of a Fabregas and play him up front as this false nine, where he dropped deeper and as they pick up possession would all press together, was an unusual type approach given the caliber of strikers they had. And a lot of this stemmed from Pep Guardiola and his success as Barcelona manager. I mean, he really championed that Spanish way and the focus on tiki-taka football, especially with that midfield dominance. And a big part of Spain's success was down to this style being easily transitioned from that Barcelona side, which was arguably one of the greatest of all time. I mean, he even utilised the false nine with Barca himself, but instead with Messi. And yeah, we've never quite seen tiki-taka replicated with the same effectiveness anywhere else since. And perhaps it's because the players used by Pep at Man City and Bayern haven't quite been at the standard of these Spanish players. So that really goes to show the technical ability of the players in that Barcelona team. And given how these players were raised with the crafting of this Spanish way, it's fair to say Pep really refined that style to make it as efficient and successful as possible.
So even though this crop of players had started to see real success at youth tournaments, especially internationally, it was only towards the mid to late 2000s that we saw these players become trusted across the board to kind of break into their respective first teams. The Spanish setup was producing world-class players like Xavi, then Iniesta, and even later than that, players like Piqué and Busquets. And to be honest, even players like Capdevila, Riera, and Sergio Garcia, who'd found themselves somewhat on the periphery of the international team, were trusted, and they were even considered integral at club level. So they all helped to bolster this history of the youth production that Spain have become known for. And it really came about from 3 main things. 1 was a strong push from the Spanish FA. 2 was this tangible proof that the system was working and could work at first team level. And 3rd, and to be honest, probably most important, was a real push from the fans, because they suddenly had homegrown heroes that were playing for their respective clubs that they could really get behind. So that big push on 3 main fronts to see these players make breakthroughs into their first teams obviously then translated to the higher level of international football, because the more experience you get playing high level club football, the more likely you are to become successful at high level international football. So the competition was there, and then the standard became extremely high as a result. We saw that as a growth at international quality, but also with a resurgence of the quality of La Liga.
On top of that, you had this Atletico Madrid side under Simeone started to sort of come alive, and even those players couldn't quite fit into the system. You had Koke, Costa, Juanfran, who fantastic players at club level, but this system was so unique and so focused that actually these top level players didn't even suit the system. And as we said before, this adoption of a false nine, despite having these great technical players, they couldn't get into the side, and that just shows the level of Spanish football at that time.
So we know how dominant this Spanish side were across the years of 2008 to 2012, but just how dominant were they? How did this happen?
That's really interesting, actually, because there are slight changes from 2008 to 2010 to 2012 that they implemented to stay on top. In 2008, there was that huge revolution and that really brave decision from Aragones, but also they were still using a 4-4-2. They just started to change that personnel slightly. So you had Xabi Alonso kind of phased out slightly in favour of Marcos Senna in the centre of midfield. Iniesta makes his first real breakthrough in the first team. So does David Silva. David Villa becomes far more prominent at the top of the pitch. They really began to introduce the Tiki-Taka style, passing and pressing dominance. They had a really solid defence. They only actually conceded 3 goals over the whole 6 games they played at the Euros in 2008. Then, after they win this 2008 tournament, Aragones steps away. He's getting towards his later years. I believe he's late 60s at this point. And Vincent Del Bosque comes in. And there's a lot of talk at the time about it being the worst time to take over. The last thing you want to do, we saw it with Ferguson at Man United, you don't want to step in and take over from a successful manager. Del Bosque is very, very adamant, though, that he is taking over at the best possible time. He can really see a future with these players. He makes another brave decision, and he even says that for himself it was a very hard one. He cuts Marcos Senna in the centre of midfield and brings in Sergio Busquets. He also brings Pedro and Piqué through into that first team as well in 2010, and he pivots to using a 4-3-3, which still focuses on the central dominance of the pitch, really utilises the technical mastery they've got in that central area with those midfield players. But it's a slight change in the distances between the lines. They defend as a 4-1-4-1, but it's different personnel within those players. David Villa would drop a lot deeper than expected to help with the pressing. And they really started to dominate even more through the centre of the pitch. Their numbers go up in terms of possession stats. They jump to 59% possession in the group stage games of the 2010 World Cup. Their passes per shot average really goes up as well. In 2008, they had 33 passes for every shot. In 2010, it's 44, and 2012, it's 58. So they really massively dominate possession, a lot more in the 2010 and 2012 tournaments. Even in 2012, David Villa picks up a massive injury, and he's been really significant for them in the national side before this point. So he can't play in the World Cup at that point, and they end up playing Fabregas in the false 9 role. So they lean even more into the passing and pressing dominance because they don't really have a particularly lethal out-and-out goal scorer up front. They do have Fernando Torres, but at international level, he didn't produce on the same level as a David Villa. So there are ever so slight changes in the philosophy and the tactics implemented. But it's interesting to see that this through path of the Tiki-Taka style continues on throughout, even though there are slight personnel and tactical switches around that.
I think another thing to remember with that side is they were phenomenal technically, but I think people forget how savvy they were. You look at that 2010 final against the Netherlands, and they came with this attitude of, well, we're going to bully you, we're going to get in you and get in hard. And I think they had, it was like nine yellow cards, the Netherlands side, even though they're renowned for this sort of total football. And yet Spain managed to hold their own. You'd think that coming up against a very physical side that actually they'd struggle, but they managed to keep playing their football. And okay, it was a very tight game, but in the end managed to get that breakthrough. And I think the savviness of this side was perhaps sort of forgotten at times, that they could see out games. They weren't just always about dominating. They knew when they had to turn it on and off.
So whilst they were untouchable during this golden era, why haven't we seen this Spanish side win an international competition since?
I think what's really interesting about this is that you had these Real Madrid and Barcelona, and even Atletico in recent years, have this much more dominant period in European football towards the back end of the 2000s. So you come into, we got 08, 09, 10, 11, and then from 2013 to 18, 5 years on the trot, we had a Spanish team win the Champions League, which is a phenomenal performance. But if you actually look at the sides now compared with that peak Barcelona side that was fielding 6-7 Spanish players, you look at the Barcelona side now, they've still got some of those same players and they're not replacing them. Gerard Piqué, Busquets are still there, Alba. You've got Sergi Roberto, who came in sort of a little bit more recently. But after that, you look at where are those next players coming through? You've got Ansu Fati, who's coming through now, who looks like a brilliant little player. But that's it, really. And again, you go across to Madrid, you have players like Sergio Ramos, who's coming to the end of his career. Isco's not quite achieved what he could have. And again, there isn't quite those same level of players. And perhaps it's been that during those early 1,000 years where they weren't quite performing and were trying to build these stronger teams, that they could be a little bit more patient in their process. But given the level of competition that we've seen in these recent years, that perhaps teams have become a bit more trigger happy and focused on more trying to sign the best players, and this sort of Galactico type approach from those top three sides. You look at Ousmane Dembele for over 130 million, trying to find quick fixes instead of relying on these academies like they used to.
Yeah, I think that's a really really good point. And there's been lots of complaints in recent years about La Masia, about the fact that there's no through pass to the first team. That's why you've had players like Takefusa Kubo go back to Japan and then end up at Real Madrid instead of Barcelona, because there was no through pass to the first team, and he wants chances to play. I also think that although their way of bringing through this golden generation, that was the biggest blessing they could possibly have had. Since that period, it's been a bit of a curse, because I think that the fact they were brought up with such a rigid system, that system was revolutionary at the time. But once someone finds the antidote, those players have been brought up to play one way and one way only, especially at national level. When they're in their sides, they've got week in, week out to develop slight tactical nuances. But with a national squad, you haven't got enough time to revolutionise your system, especially with the same players. So you find that these players, these legends now, your Iniestas, your Xavis of the world, especially in 2014 when they're still at their peak of their powers, you can't really move on those legends out of the first team just to make room for a new crop that isn't as good. But that, as a result, means they're stuck in the tactical ways of Tiki-Taka. So when you come up to the 2014 World Cup and Germany are just as technically good, but potentially a little bit nastier, a little bit more effective in terms of moving the ball forward quickly. And especially now watching the 2018 World Cup, where, the blistering pace of someone like an Mbappe, but they also dominate centrally with players like Paul Pogba. This has been the revolution and the evolution of this system. But it's meant that the players in the Spanish side are kind of caught in the era of 2010. They play football like it's 2010. And I think they're going to have to change slightly going forward if they want to be successful again.
Despite this fall, do we think there's any way of them coming back?
I think what's evident of these sort of Spanish sides over the years, especially at club level, is that every time there's been a bit of a dull period, they've been able to reimagine their side, revolutionise it, and change the way they think about football. So I think given these last couple of years, they've perhaps dropped off a little bit. I think that could be the catalyst for change. You look at England's emergence with their success in the Champions League and doing quite well at the last World Cup, and these other sides coming into their own, like France. Perhaps this will be a wake-up call for them, and perhaps you might see some of these sides change their approach again and try and rethink the way they attack this problem again.
So, from the birth of a philosophy and a unified focus on development over time, accompanied by raw talent and a desire to succeed, we saw a Spanish side unrivalled at the pinnacle of the game. Even with a recent decline, the legacy of this team will live on and could indeed be cause for a modern resurgence. We hope to have brought some clarity to the rise of the most dominant international side ever. Until next time.